press interpreted her hand as drawing attention to her sexuality, even though nudes for centuries had shown women with their hand placed across their genitals.
You mentioned the kind of flatness of her body, and some art historians even said she's a bit of a paper cutout. And Manet, of course, in so much of his work, really does reject the clear articulation of represented space and confronts the viewer with the complexity of painting on a two-dimensional surface. And an area where you can really see that are, for instance, in the way the toes peek out from under her slipper. There is this awkwardness that reminds us that all of this is illusion and that, in fact, there is just this two-dimensionality of this canvas.
There's a kind of unmasking. Manet is saying, I'm not going to pretend that my painting isn't paint. I'm not going to present you with this perfect illusion, the way that academic artists are doing, where you don't even see a brushstroke. So he's insisting on unmasking that illusion. And then he's insisting on unmasking the illusion of our own interests in looking at these images. He's reminding us that our interest here is a sexual one.
Right, in so many traditional representations of the nude, because the figure is not looking out at us, we can comfortably look at her. But here we're confronted by her gaze and by her thinking. And there is a much more problematic experience here.
And that's in the fact that she's a real woman, she's contemporary, and the way she picks her head up, the way she looks out at us, the angularity of her body, it's in all those things. And people at the time in 1865 recognized it.
So this is a painting that is only partially about the nude. This is a painting about art making and about the kinds of conventions that exist in art and making us, the viewer, aware of those conventions, even as we look at this painting.
Manet is saying, let's be honest about the materials, let's be honest about the subject and our own motives and desires. And I think that that's a really interesting thing for art to do. The great poet and art critic Charles Baudelaire called on artists to paint the beauty of modern life. And I think Manet is taking up that call.
Manet is inventing what beauty could be for the modern world.
Okay, so how does this challenge tradition for just subject? Who is this an image of? What did they say it was the subject of? Who is she?
It said it was like a prostitute.
Right, she is a prostitute. It's not a mistress of a dude. It's not a wife. It's not a classical nude. It's not mythological. It's a real person, right? And notice that instead of being coy, right, like the Cabanel, or even in a way kind of like Legrand Adolesque, she looks directly at the viewer, right? So she's making direct eye contact with you. And a lot of people, when they look at this painting, we know that these past paintings, these paintings of the classical nude, were often used for male gaze. And so there's this idea here that Manet intentionally made it so that she was gazing directly back at us, right? Confronting that gaze, right? And then when I say that Manet is kind of like the father of modern art, right? A lot of it goes to modeling and technique. What did they say about how he painted this? Eva, can you help me out with that one? What did he do to paint this? What did he emphasize?
He emphasized the shadows in her one hand that was covering her genitals, and everything else he kind of left off the dimension in her body.
Right. So she's very flat. There's kind of like this, he shaded using black, and black kind of dirties up a color, especially when something has as much white in it as her pale skin. And so he used black to outline her hands and outline her body, right? There's not a lot of gradual transition, and it kind of dirties up her hand. What did they say about the mark making? You can see a lot of it in the collar of the servant or in the background. What did they say about the brushstroke? kind of Velasquez like. Remember Las Niñas, right? Remember all that visible brushstroke? It's really about, this is a painting. And so he wanted to emphasize the qualities of it being a painting, right? So it's an update of something like the Venus of Urbino, right? So this is a Chardin still life of an earlier period, and he copied the cat, at least the angle. It's not the same color as the cat, because of course one is a black cat, but you can see that he used a very similar sort of style. He also, when he was updating this, went back to Titian's Venus of Urbino, and he included the servants, right? So instead of having two servants finding clothes, here we have a servant bringing flowers, right? So this was ridiculed, right? Totally ridiculed. And a lot of artists have done contemporary updates. So here's Barbie, right? Kind of scary looking, right? And so we talked about a lot of this already, but what I want to mention too is that he was intentionally trying to shock the art establishment, right? He was shocking by his painting technique, his subject matter, right? That this is a prostitute or a sex worker of the day, right? But also the cat, right? We normally see images of dogs with women or couples, right? Dogs are the symbols of what? What are dogs the symbol of?
Loyalty.
Loyalty and fidelity, right? Thank you for. And so here we have a cat instead, and he intentionally picked a cat because there's another name for a cat that's kind of derogatory to a part of female genitalia. And so he really was intentionally trying to shock, right? He was trying to shock. So if we think about how this is a modern painting, right? How is it modern? It's got contemporary subject, even though I can't spell it. It's got marginalized people. So it has a sex worker and her servant who is also of a different race, right? He could have chose a white servant and he chose someone who was black instead, right? To kind of talk about class and race in France. The brushstroke has those flat, broad brushstrokes, outline, sketchy quality, and minimal value, right? He's intentionally breaking tradition in numerous ways, even if your teacher can't spell. I see a bunch of ears up there, but that's okay. So here is our tradition so far, right? So these are our 3 classical nudes, and we see how they're all different, right? Like I mentioned, Manet also was often considered to be an impressionist. He painted with them, he showed art exhibits with them, and he changed his style accordingly. So this is one that's in the Art Institute that's pretty famous, where he was doing subject matter based on contemporary day and capturing a moment in time. We'll talk more about impressionists later. Okay, so we're going to move into another category of art, and we're calling this realism. Manet, I would say, is a realist painter as well. And so we're going to be looking at class and society. And so for the 18th, 19th century, or I should say 19th century, we have a few different themes. The first theme is rest in peace, or RIP, our revoir to tradition. And so the reason I have our revoir here these are primarily French movements. They were a revolt against Romanticism and the Salon. The traditions of the past were no longer viewed as ideal. These are moving towards more modernist thought. It's no longer necessary to paint with photographic accuracy because of the invention of photography. There's a whole new aesthetic. Aesthetic is kind of like the taste of art. So we're going to be seeing new kinds of compositions, new kinds of elements of what is beautiful, and the intent of the artist, or the purpose of the artwork. There's an emphasis on the observable world due to the positivist Impressionists are all able to do this. So the R stands for realism, I stands for impressionism, and the P stands for post-impressionism. So this is the art of the later 19th century. We have a really short name for realism. Realism is the art of its own time. So art that is real or appeals to be real. And so this is art that is based on the natural observable world. Courbet, who is the most famous realist painter that we have, he was commissioned by a church to paint a ceiling, and they wanted him to paint some angels, and he said, I can't. I've never seen an angel. So if I've never seen an angel, I can't possibly paint one. I don't know what it looks like. So he was really overly concerned with what you could really see, really observe. Realist painters tend to be art of the common man, or in Manet's case, the common woman, right? And then modern environment and subject matter. So this is the artwork that is in the 250, and it's called The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet, right? So this is number 113, The Stonebreakers. And so let's describe the image. Who is depicted? So it's kind of hard because we don't see faces here, but do we have any guesses who these people are? Who are these people?
Like poor workers.
They are poor workers, very good. And so these are basically people who are working on a road. So they are building a road or fixing a road. And so when we look at this, right, first, it's very Baroque-like. What I mean by that is the action is up front and in your face. So Courbet was intentionally trying to show the hardship and the hard, like, look how hard these people's lives are. And he's gonna, like, it's like a newspaper. It's like, let's put the facts in front of your face, okay? It's got dramatic lighting, and it's got a lot of realistic brushstroke and detail. So you can see the texture of the rocks, you can see the rocky landscape, you can see the smoothness of the skin, or actually the roughness of the skin, because they're workers, right? But you can see the fabric and so on, right? So on the left, right, on the left, we have a young man. He's probably younger than some of you, right? So we have this young man on the left, and Courbet is basically saying, this guy should be in school. He should be not doing this heavy lifting, right? And notice that he's got a big, like, basket full of heavy rocks, and he's kind of like lunging forward under that weight, right? And then the man on the right is, under the hat, is an old man. So we've got kind of the polar opposites. We've got a young man, and we have an old man who should probably be retired. But because he's poor, he's forced to labor in a really hard job, right? So these people represent the everyman who work too hard and who are taken advantage of. Okay, so that's what Courbet is often depicted. He's depicting the common everyday person. And he does it in this very realistic style. Now, the Stonebreakers was also rejected from the salon, right? Why do you think this one was so rejected by the salon? Cora, do you have a guess? Why would this be rejected? It's not vulgar.
Possibly because it's making almost like a political statement. Like you said that he should be in school and the other guy should be retired.
Right, it's too real, right? It's too real. It's rebelling against tradition. It's not historical. It's not classical. It's not romantic. It's contemporary people, and it's kind of showing the negatives of French society, right? Why do either of these guys have to work so hard? Shouldn't government be taking care of them? And so Courbet is kind of cool. He decides to have his own salon. And he actually rented out a barn and called it the Pavilion of Realism. And so he put 13 of his own paintings in this barn and showed it across the river from the official salon in 1855. So he was kind of cutting edge as well. And so here's some of the paintings that he exhibited with it. Sadly, the Stonebreakers was destroyed in Dresden in World War II, so it doesn't exist anymore. However, this is another famous Courbet painting, and I want to show you size, right? How is the size radical for the subject matter? This is probably another reason why it was rejected. It's enormous, right? Enormous paintings are historical paintings, and this is subject matter of like everyday people. And so it's very, 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 very big, right? So Courbet and Manet were both realistic painters, right? And so, you know, kind of seeing how their styles are different, right? This is much more flat and thus more visible brushstroke, but they both have contemporary subject matter of real people. Right? So here's the burial of the Ornans. This was a burial in a village of his uncle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I've talked too much today. But then this is another painting that he did, which is pretty famous. It's that large one that we just saw. And it's basically his world. And so what he has on the subject matter is his subject matter. So on the left, it's the people he paints. So these are the common everyday people. On the right are his patrons, so the people who buy his work. And then of course he's right in the middle. And so he's depicted right in the middle in front of one of his canvases. And he has himself, and he has a little child that symbolizes innocence. And then he has a nude woman to reflect his inspiration, which I find really funny because that's not too realistic either. And he wouldn't paint angels. So here's some other realists. This is Manet. A lot of people did farm workers of the day to show the hardship. These are women who are collecting remnants of wheat to bake bread in their house. They're not trying to sell it at the market. They're just trying to live. This is a female painter, Rosa Bonheur. She was known for her animal paintings. She was actually allowed by the French government. She had a special badge she got to wear that said she got to wear pants. Isn't that exciting? She was given official permission to be able to wear pants because she was going into farmland, and she had like a barn area in the city of Paris with animals that she used as her subject matter. And you can't really climb a fence in these dresses that the women had to wear of the day. So she was given special permission. She's really known for her horse images, so equestrian paintings. So remember that the realists, right, are based on naturalism, art of the common man, and they're revolting against the salon, romanticism, and history painting. Okay. So that, I should make sure. I think we're, oh, shoot, never mind, we're not yet. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, the next artwork we have is kind of interesting. This is Nadar raising photography to the height of art. This is by the artist Honoré Daumier. So Honoré Daumier. And when you look at this painting, or this print, it's a print. Is this print art or is it a cartoon? What do you think? Is it art or is it a cartoon? Jasmine, what do you think? Is it art or a cartoon?
It kind of looks like both. Like, it kind of seems like it's...
What's artistic about it? What do you think?
Like the proportions are all like fairly realistic.
So it's got realistic proportions. Anything about this cartoon like? Raphael, what do you think?
I was gonna say it kind of looks like a modern day advertisement for like a photo, or like, sorry, not a photo, but like a poster.
It looks like, it kind of looks like a editorial cartoon in a newspaper. I don't know if you guys know what newspapers are, but newspapers, I know they're hardly anyone reads them anymore, but they're these, daily things that come out, not on your phones, right? And they're printed in black and white. And often there's an editorial section, and it's one of the areas where you can actually show your political bias, right? You can actually have your point of view, because news is supposed to be unbiased. And so throughout the rest of the newspaper, it's like looking at it from both sides. But in the editorial section, it's very pointed. And so it does take on the characteristics of kind of like an editorial cartoon, right? An editorial cartoon. And so here, Daumier is kind of doing both. For him, he did this to mock Nadar. We probably won't get to talking about Nadar today. I'll see how much we can get through, because we will move into some photography. But Nadar was a very famous photographer. And Nadar, he was trying to elevate photography to a high art status. So photography at the very beginning was considered more of a science than an art form, because it's basically built on light and chemical reactions, right? And so Nadar was like, well, we can use photography for art's sake. And so he actually went to court to permission photography to be seen as a high art form. And so Daumier actually is kind of making fun of Nadar by putting his imagery high in the air, right? So it's to make it high art. The funny thing is Nadar actually owned a hot air balloon. So Nadar actually bought a hot air balloon so that he could take aerial photography. So here's some examples of it. These two images here are actually in Nadar's studio. He had a backdrop that looked like clouds, and people could take pictures standing in his basket to pretend that they were in a hot air balloon. But he actually went up there and took photos. So this C image over here is an aerial photo of Paris, right? And so Nadar, right, would use this hot air balloon to take these pictures. And a lot of people actually didn't like it. If you look here, it kind of is foreshadows modern aerial surveillance photography. And a lot of people thought that it kind of was too intrusive. They didn't like the fact that he was going in the sky taking pictures of people without them knowing. And so Daumier used lithography. Lithography is a printing technique where you draw on a stone. So this is not a metal technique. It's on stone. You use a wax crayon, and you can draw it almost shaped like a pencil. Not that Nadar necessarily rendered it very smoothly. You can see a lot of his mark making here. But you can mass produce these images and make thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. So Nadar, he was really known for his portrait painting, portrait photography, I should say, right? And so how is it mocking, right? So let's just look at the image. We're like focus on the style. How is it mocking? How is it mocking? How is he making fun of the guy in the basket? Jeffrey, what do you think?
It kind of looks like the pose feels very unrealistic, and his hat's also like flying off.
Right? So his hat's flying off. Would you feel safe in this hot air balloon? If that was you?
No.
No, it almost looks like he's falling out. It's like it's more important to get that perfect picture than the welfare of Nadar, right? So he uses the idea of his hat flying flying off, and he's so excited about being in the balloon that he's about to fall out of the balloon. And then he also, if you look in Paris, the word photography is repeated over and over and over again. And so photography becomes so popular that even middle class people could afford to have a photo taken of themselves. And so he was kind of trying to make a kind of like a make fun of the idea that there's like a photo studio on every corner in Paris. It's kind of like a Starbucks. Like there's just way too many. There's like a photo studio across the street from another photo studio, right? So he's making fun of contemporary society. Here's Nadar's studio. Notice all the glass, right? So this is Nadar, not Daumier. He had a lot of natural light coming in to his studio. Daumier did a lot of political cartoon-like images. So here we have a drunken man. He has a series of caricatures in sculpture, and there's a bunch of them at the Art Institute if you ever get to the museum. These two guys at the bottom are politicians. You can kind of tell he's making fun of them. And then this is one of his more famous painters, and it's called The Third Class. And so it's basically like the working poor are not seen by the upper class or the upper middle class. So he was often considered to be a realist as well. Okay. Any questions on realism? Okay, we'll get started with photography. I don't think we're going to get as far as I hoped today, but that's okay. Because I actually have planned 102 for today and 102 planned for Tuesday. So we're going to be looking at innovation and experimentation in photography. You need to stand up and stretch for a second. You can. So the positive influence on art. The positive age is an age of faith in the positive consequences of close observation of the natural world and human realm. This is based on social science. And so this kind of new science of like psychology and sociology and anthropology that's developing, and they're trying to figure out how humans behave. This is a time of philosophy as well. And so with this positive influence, we have creation of realism in painting, right? We have the scientific invention of photography. We have impressionism, which we'll talk about another day on Tuesday, which is kind of the scientific emphasis of optical qualities of light and color. And we have a lot of new material being used for architecture. So we see a lot of transition in art during this time. So early photography often is based on tradition, right? It's often based on tradition. And so looking at these three artworks, what is the tradition? The first one on the left is still life. Inanimate objects. We have photos that look like historical paintings. We have landscape paintings or landscape photography. We have artwork that is based on teaching morals. We have photos based on portraits, and we have fashion and beauty images. And so a lot of early photography is based on traditional subject matter that existed in painting and sculpture. Kind of makes sense when you have a new art form. Photography was often used by artists. They used it as a tool. So people like Delacroix and Hans would take pictures of their models and would draw from them or paint from them. And so they were able to have people hold hard poses. So instead of a model having to like stand in an awkward pose for hours upon hours, they could take a picture, right? It would still take maybe hours to print, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then they could use it day after day after day. So it was probably cheaper for them too, because they didn't have to pay for a model for so long, right? So here is kind of like the very first cameras. They were very little like your camera phone, right? So these are the old-fashioned cameras. You don't need to probably know all of this vocabulary, but I think it's probably important that we understand a little bit about how cameras work in order to understand the photos that we're going to see. So have mirrors inside of them too to reflect the image and to flip it, right? So you have a dark box, then you have an opening, and we call that opening the aperture, right? We call that the aperture. The aperture is the size of the opening. And so we can control how much light comes into a camera based on the size of that aperture, right? We can make it super tiny, or we can make it super big. Now, super tiny apertures actually have a lot of detail. Everything's in focus. Things that get bigger tend to have blur behind them and are in focus up close. So on your camera phone, you know that portrait mode that makes everything blurry in the background? That would be kind of the equivalent to a large aperture, right? And then that aperture opens and closes, and that's called a shutter. So the shutter is how much the camera is open for how much time, how much light is allowed in. So light is controlled by how fast that shutter moves and how big the opening is. And then we use things like lenses to flip the images, to make the images in focus. And then we have to record them on something. So the image gets recorded onto either a piece of metal, a piece of paper, or a piece of film. So like plastic is probably what we have today. Back then they used glass and metal and paper. So this is the first known photo by Joseph Niepce. Notice it's from 1826. Does anyone know what it's an image of? It's a view of a window. It took 8 hours for this picture to be made. So basically he had a camera and he put, he put some piece of glass and he coated it with emulsion. So basically he opened up the camera, set it on his windowsill, and for 8 hours light came into that box and darkened all of this stuff. And that's why there's this big shadow here, because that represents a long period of time, right? So this is kind of like a scientific, this was kind of like a scientific investigation. Now this is Daguerre. So this is the guy who kind of invented another type of photography. Niepce, who we just saw, worked with Daguerre early on. And Niepce actually sold the formula to the French government. And so in our first photo of the 250, it's called Still Life in Studio. So he is using the Daguerre type process. So when it comes to form and context, he's using the Daguerre type. This is a portable process. This is what people like Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady was a photographer during the Civil War. When you see a lot of your history books, which have scenes of warfare, a lot of those were done by him. And you could take this little mini darkroom and camera in a wagon, and you can move it around. And they basically use silver particles with iodine to expose the image. And so they would put these things on metal. So Daguerre types were metal prints, right? And so here's some of the contraptions and stuff that they would use. You could buy a box. So this is kind of like a mini darkroom. We have all the chemicals, all the vials, all the bottles, all the dishes, all the equipment that you would possibly need. This is kind of a portable darkroom that a lot of photographers use. A lot of people like Nadar had studios, so they would have large windows to let in light. And so people would go and get their portraits taken, right? So this little metal thing here is holding that guy firm so that he doesn't move, because most early cameras took minutes to get your exposure. It wasn't an instant thing and then you got to leave. You have to sit still for a long time. It's one of the reasons why a lot of early photos don't have people smiling in them, because holding a smile for that long would look really fake, but also would probably have blur. So do you think this early photo is science or art? by Daguerre. Do you think he intended this to be science or art? What do you think? There's no right or wrong answer, I should say. What's your opinion? Get everyone to talk today, so anyone want to volunteer? How could it be science? Okay, I'll just talk. We're at the end, so I want to get through it. So the light, right? He intentionally put this by an open window, and I can tell because there's a strong light coming in here from the left side, right? And he also intentionally chose a bunch of white things. This is a white relief. These are white, like plaster sculptures. And so you have a faster exposure, like it would be like take less time for you to actually take the picture, right? So we intentionally use light objects to record the image, right? However, look at the subject matter. He intentionally arranged these objects on the windowsill, right? So that could be using the still life as kind of a art form, right? So it has traditional subject matter for a still life, right? This is another early piece. Look at the date here, 1837. Daguerreotypes were not the only type of photography of the day. Daguerreotypes being printed on metal. So the photos were on metal. William Henry Talbot developed a process that we call calotype, and he used paper negatives. So a much cheaper material. The cool thing about a calotype is that you can print multiple copies. So a daguerreotype was a one-of-a-kind photo. You could print it only once. And a calotype was, on that paper negative, you made a negative image. So in the darkroom, you could make as many positives as you wanted, right? This is not one from obviously 1837, but I wanted to show you an example of what a negative image looks like versus a positive, right? Pictorialism was really common, and it was formulated by the Photographic Society of England. And so they often represent Victorian England and kind of elevate photography to history painting. So this is a really cool one. This has the same people repeated over and over and over again. So that he took 30 different negatives and like intricately cut them and put them together to make this one scene. Kind of cool, right? This is Robinson, and they made kind of like melodramatic scenes, kind of like some of that morality painting that we saw. Juliet Margaret Cameron was a very famous photographer this time period. She got a camera from her daughters when she was like over 40 and decided to become a photographer, which was kind of nice because she knew a lot of famous people. So she knew a lot of scientists, poets, writers, artists of the day. And so she did very famous pictures of like this guy, which of course cannot remember. This is Thomas Carl. She knew Herschel. She knew Darwin, right? So that's Charles Darwin. She took a lot of pictures of her children. And so she would do these kind of mythological, Victorian, like, you know, based on Victorian stories of the day, images of her children, right? And then Nadar, remember the guy in the hot air balloon, right? He used the collodion process, which is kind of a wet darkroom process. And so he would allow the light to come in so his photos were faster. And he had these big like tarps in the room so he could control the light. And he also took a lot of pictures of famous people. So this is Baudelaire, Sarah Bernhardt, who was a famous actress of the day. So here, people started taking their cameras on wagons. So we have a lot of photography taken on the West in the United States. So taking pictures of exotic locations, places like National Geographic are going to be invented during this time. Going to the Wild West. And then here's examples of Matthew Brady. So he was a very famous Civil War photographer, and he would take images of what war was really like, right? And so he documented, and these were printed in newspapers. So he would be able to show how war isn't glamorized, and he was telling stories of real people. So these are all Matthew Brady photos, right? So we'll stop there and we'll continue with photography on Tuesday. If you have any questions on your way out, feel free to ask.